child development, really human development, there's a whole child aspect that addresses not just the intellectual or the cognitive development, but also the physical aspects. We have fine motor skills and large motor skills that we need to be paying attention to as well. We can have brilliant kids, but if they don't have a solid social emotional aspect to their development, if they aren't socially and emotionally healthy, all that intelligence really isn't going to, benefit them or society much.
Hi, I'm Ron Spurnberg, co-founder and CEO of Hi Mama. Welcome to our podcast about all things early childhood education.
Amanda, welcome to the Preschool podcast.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So Amanda, let's start off learning more about intentional whole child development, and perhaps we can begin with learning what that actually means.
Right. So at Not Just Cute, where I write, I'm really passionate about making sure that the choices that we're making about whether it's parenting or working in the classroom, when we're working with young children, that it's based on what we know about how they grow and learn. So that's kind of where those come from, that we're intentional about the choices that we're making and that it's based on actual principles of child development. I feel like there are a lot of places, a lot of ways that it becomes really easy to just do what we're doing because that's how it's always been done, or policy decisions that are made not based on the best science or the best reference points. And so I try to guide everything that I write and speak about on this premise that the way we serve children needs to be based on being intentional and basing it in good information on whole child development, or addressing the whole child's needs.
And so is it fair to say that it's kind of like asking the why about why you're doing something, not just focusing on what you're doing?
Absolutely, yes. That's something that I teach about quite a bit, actually. I think especially as teachers, it's easy to get fixated on the what. What am I doing tomorrow? What are we doing? Yeah. What's on my lesson plan, right? But really, we have to start, it's similar to what Simon Sinek teaches. We have to start with why. And if we know why we're doing it, it changes what we do and it changes how we do it so that we can do it in a way that's more effective for the kids that we're working with.
Cool. And another piece of that, which you mentioned, is the whole child. Can you clarify what you mean by that?
Right. So when we look at the domains of child development, the intellectual development is really just one part, and that's the part that as a culture, as society, we tend to fixate on when we talk about education,
right.
Just feeding the intellect. But child development, really human development, there's a whole child aspect that addresses not just the intellectual or the cognitive development, but also the physical aspects. We have fine motor skills and large motor skills that we need to be paying attention to as well, and especially the social and emotional aspects, which I'm very passionate about. And just recognizing that there are all these parts of this whole child, that it's not, it's not just a brain that comes to us at school, but it's this whole child that's part of a family and part of a community and part of a culture and an environment. And just recognizing that all those pieces affect the way that that child learns. If we want to go back to that cognitive piece, that we have to pay attention to all those pieces of the system, but also recognizing that those other aspects of development are also important. We can have brilliant kids, but if they don't have a solid social emotional aspect to their development, if they aren't socially and emotionally healthy, all that intelligence really isn't going to, benefit them or society much.
Yeah, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there's a lot of research and literature behind that as well, correct?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, so I know we've had other guests on the show, and one in particular who they have sort of this pyramid model, and they need that foundation before that intellectual and cognitive development can proceed to where we want it to go. You need those fundamentals. So I think that's a very good point. Now, another thing that you've done in your work is published a lot of your thoughts online with the blog Not Just Cute. Why did you decide to put your thoughts online and share them with the public?
Well, it's interesting how it started and how it's developed since then. So I started it about, I think it's almost 9 years now, and I had taught in many different roles and worked with children in different roles. And at the time, I think I was teaching in a small preschool setting. And I think shortly after that is when I started doing some teaching and consulting as well. So around that same starting period. And I was with a friend whose child I had taught, who doesn't come from an education background, but is very well educated herself. And as we were talking, she just kind of stopped me and said, you assume that everyone knows these things that you know about early childhood education, about development. And sometimes I think all of us do as early childhood educators. A lot of the things we know, it just seems like common sense to us. And she just kind of stopped me and said, you assume everyone knows what you know, and they don't. This would really be helpful for parents like myself and other people who would want to understand the why of, why are you doing what you do? It's not just a cute activity. It's not just something that fills the time, but it actually has a purpose. And she found that really fascinating as a parent, that these activities had a much deeper purpose than what would meet the eye. And so that's where it started. I just started writing about some of the experiences I had and some of the thoughts that would, I just tend to be a thinker. And so it was a place to put these thoughts and things that I was reading about or hearing about and processing. Writing has just been one of my favorite modes of processing ideas. And so it started just as a place to put these ideas. And then this is back when blogging was fairly new. And, it just is one of those things that begins to evolve. And lo and behold, people were actually reading it, right? And so I started to get feedback from people, and it just has grown into something that I really enjoy and has really offered me opportunities to connect with educators around the United States and around the world and hear more about their experiences in these different places and how similar so many of them are. And it's something I'm really passionate about, making sure that these educators and also the parents that they work with can communicate in a common language and can have access to the same resources to help them serve these young children in the best way that they know how.
And it's such a good point about your friend or your colleague that you mentioned there, that most parents don't know much about early childhood education, right? Even the most educated of parents, I think most still kind of have this sense that the primary school learning and development is the critical piece, right? Like like you said, the cognitive development, reading and writing and arithmetic and these things. And as early childhood educators, we know that that's not true, and it's so important, all these other areas of development at the youngest ages, but a lot of parents just don't know. So it's great that you've taken up the cause to inform them a bit more about education at a young age. And have you gotten much feedback from parents in terms of your readers, and have they been able to apply some of the thoughts that you're sharing through your site?
I do. I have. I need to do a newer, updated poll, but as I've checked in with readers and who is coming to the site, I seem to have it's a kind of a 30-30-30 mix of educators and parents, and then the other 30 or so is parents and educators, educators who are parents. But I get a lot of feedback from parents saying, this is something I hadn't thought about or hadn't realized, things that we take for granted as educators, whether it's about education, or I write quite a bit about positive guidance as well, which is another area where I realized as educators, we're trained on, this is how we deal with child behavior, and this is an appropriate approach, and we know why. And a lot of parents don't get that same information. And it was another epiphany to me to realize, these tools that I use as an educator, I use them as a parent as well, because it's based on child development, not on environment. And so that's where a lot of feedback from parents comes there, but also on educational pieces where I'll hear from parents saying, I knew in my gut this was the right way, but I was hearing all these other voices or pressures. And a lot of parents, it's interesting, I'll hear from one parent saying, I've been trying to explain this to my spouse, and now you've given me the words where I can explain it a little bit better. And a lot of feedback from educators who say they use some of that information to educate parents, which is something I love hearing, that that it kind of bridges that gap. I'm really passionate about making sure they bridge that gap, because I feel like as educators, it's easy to get frustrated that parents or society at large doesn't understand how important it is, or doesn't understand where we're coming from. And it is frustrating, but I also feel like if we can't do that, then who will? We need to be our first advocates. If we can't articulate in a way that can communicate and help get that point across and advocate for kids and for early education. No one else is going to do it for us. And so that's part of what I focus on, making sure that we can get those points across in a way that can communicate to people who don't have that same background of early education, so that they will still appreciate where we're coming from and recognize the value that we're offering.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's very important for early childhood educators to embrace educating parents as part of their role, because it's so important to educate them on the importance of early childhood education because, as you mentioned, a lot of parents are unaware of that. Something else that I read on your website was that part of what your audience and yourself are trying to do is protecting childhood from the too much, too soon culture of today. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Sure. I think, if we're looking at society at large, there's kind of this pervasive idea that the more our children act like adults, then the more advanced they are, right? So if they can, use technology and balance our checkbook and do our taxes for us and all these things, then our child is advanced, and that's kind of the goal that we're working for. And we feel a lot of those pressures when I talk to groups about this topic. Hands go up when I ask for examples, and they're talking about pressures to read earlier and earlier, or pressures to be potty trained earlier and earlier, or the way that sports have changed for young children, that it's become something completely different than when we were children. Just all these different pressures where, in essence, the end goal is to get children to act older and older, sooner and sooner. But the reality, again, if we go back to science and development, which is where I try to stay grounded, science bears out the fact that the longer a childhood period is for a species, the more intelligent they are, the larger their brain is, the more flexible thinkers they are. So the reality is that the shorter and faster childhood is does not equal more intelligence or being more advanced. It's the opposite, that there are longer childhood periods for species who are more intelligent, and that's because they need that time to develop, and they need that time for experience as well. And so again, we have this social pressure, but it's really antithetical to what we know from science and about development, that children need time, and they need experience, and they need space to be children, and that there's no racing through it. There's no prize for getting through childhood faster.
That's super interesting. And I think it also ties the conversation together a little bit about, if we're educating parents about why early childhood education is so important, using some of these research-based facts and information is helpful, as opposed to just telling them, okay, it's very important that your child develops in this way and that way, but providing some information about why that is the case. So that's super cool. And this also leads me to the next question or point of conversation, which is something I think you're quite passionate about, as am I, is the linking of theory and practice. I think this is something that's a constant challenge for early childhood education, because it is so difficult in the classroom dealing with multiple children at a young age. Any advice or thoughts on how to make that balance as an early childhood educator?
I think two things come to mind. I think the first thing is to stay open. I think it's really easy to get rigid and to do things the way they've always been done, or to accept something as best practice because it's always been called best practice.
Right.
And so we need to stay open and stay aware and keep learning, and be willing to practice outside of the box. And with practice come mistakes. Not always going to work out perfectly, but to be open to doing new things and to do things differently. I think one example that comes to mind, I was just recently working with a group, and a pair of teachers told me that they had started letting their preschoolers chew gum, which the whole room kind of gasped, because nobody allows gum into their preschool classroom. But they said, we found that they have several special needs in their classroom, and some of them included some mouth strengthening needs and some sensory needs. And so they said, we don't just allow it all the time, but during our story time, when we set up the environment to make it work and set up the boundaries to make it work. But they said we found that they really benefit from chewing gum while we have our story time. It helps them pay attention. It helps them build some of these oral skills that they're needing. And it works for them. And I just love that as an example of, just they looked at some of the research that supported this as a beneficial activity, and they made a plan so that they would have the right boundaries, and they were willing to try something completely new that kind of goes against, what is common practice. So one is to stay open and to try new things and to not become too rooted, even in, again, like I said, even in things that we've always called best practice, because things evolve and change. So to stay open, stay current. And then the second is to just accept that we're not going to be perfect. When we talk about applying theory into our classroom, it's really easy to get down on ourselves as teachers that we're not doing all the things all the time, and we're not getting it all perfect all the time, and that this theory that is perfect when we put it on paper in black and white is really messy when we put it in our classroom. And so recognizing that we're going to have successes and we're going to have challenges every single day, and that doesn't necessarily mean that we've got it all wrong. It just means that we're human beings working with small human beings, and so it's going to be messy and it's going to be challenging, but to be reflective and see how we can, again, go back to that first one, be adaptive and be open to change and, make those small improvements, but to not get frustrated too soon, too quickly, just because we're not perfect, that these perfect concepts don't look perfect in our classroom today. It's a journey, and we have to have that patience with ourselves that we offer to the kids that we work with, to recognize that we too are learning and that we too will make mistakes along the way, and to be patient with that growth.
Yeah, that's awesome advice. And I think it sort of speaks as well to early childhood educators to feel empowered to try different things, right? Best practices, as you say, are what they are. They're best practices, but also your great example speaks to the fact that every child is different, right? So, just because something is a general best practice, it doesn't mean it's the best thing for every child out there. We know that every child's different. And then also on your second point, I think that also speaks to the administrators out there, directors and owners of childcare programs to know that, trying different things is important and beneficial to children's development. So allowing your educators to try different things and giving them that flexibility and knowing that not everything is going to be perfect all the time, I think is important for them to keep in mind too. Now, what is exciting you most in early childhood education right now?
I think right now what is exciting to me is that I really feel like, on the one hand, we're hearing a lot about, as you mentioned, this too much too soon culture, and a lot of pressures that are pushing appropriate practice out of the classroom, that play is disappearing, and all those things are really frustrating and frightening and disappointing. But I think the flip side of that is exciting to me, is I do feel like there is a lot of movement, a lot of energy behind reversing that trend. And I really feel like good information is getting to good people, and that teachers are learning to advocate better, and parents are getting on board. And I'm hearing more and more about that trend. As much as I feel like, that trend is that pressure is still there, I really feel hopeful and excited that there is pushback, and, just like that pendulum swing goes back and forth so often, I do feel like we're starting to move back to the center where we need to be. That I'm excited to hear from teachers and administrators and parents who are on board with returning and protecting play and approaching education in a developmentally appropriate way. And that's really exciting to me to hear from other people who are passionate about that as well. And I feel like it really is swelling in our society. I think that is growing.
Yeah, me too. I think it's awesome. I think and especially you're seeing, great research and information coming out of super credible sources like Harvard and Nobel laureates that are all saying, how important early childhood education is, and are supporting the field, which is a super positive trend. In 30 seconds or less, what advice do you have for young ECs out there that might just be starting out their careers?
I think early on, anywhere in your career, I think one of the most important things to remember is to realize how powerful you are, even though you may just be one teacher in one classroom, to recognize that you can have this immeasurable impact. I think that bears out in research. They talk about resiliency and how children who come from all these circumstances that say they shouldn't have success in life and they end up succeeding, it comes down to at least one adult in their life who supported them and loved them and made a difference. And I think that's really powerful to realize that you can change a whole system, a whole school, but even if you change one child, one family, that impact is just incalculable. And I think that that's really inspiring at any level of your career.
Awesome advice, and really great conversation with you, Amanda. I think you've really hit the point very well on intentional whole child development, what that means, why it's so important, and it's great that you're sharing your thoughts and creating a community of parents and educators who can have a conversation about the importance of early childhood education and why it's so important. If I'm listening to the podcast and I want to get in touch with you, Amanda, or learn more about your work, where would I go to find you?
So you can find me at my site. It's notjustcute, all one word, .com. So notjustcute.com. And then I also have a presence on Facebook and Twitter. You can find me there. And you can contact me through my website at notjustcute.
Awesome. Thanks for coming on the show, Amanda.
Thanks so much for having me.
If you enjoyed our conversation, don't forget to subscribe for more episodes and leave a review. The Preschool Podcast is brought to you by Hi Mama. If you're anything like the thousands of teachers listening to the Preschool Podcast, you know how long it takes to fill out daily sheets, child portfolios, and lesson plans. And that's where Hi Mama saves the day. With an easy-to-use interface built by teachers for teachers, Hi Mama can cut the time you spend on documentation and parent engagement in half. Create and send beautiful daily sheets, photos, videos, and messages to parents in seconds, saving you time in your busy day. Podcast listeners can get a free tour with one of our community advisors. Go to